Principal Matters Podcast, episode 493. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker back with my co-host, Dr. Jen Schwanke, for another Principal Matters podcast. Jen, this week, our guest is going to be Cummins, Bogan, a great friend, but also the same group that you and I were talking about in our Monday Matters. I've met her through that work in Louisville, Kentucky. So I just thought we'd just do this back to back and listeners have the opportunity to get to meet her. But before we do that, we have a question of the week. And our question of the week is supported by Summer Pop's Math Workbooks. Principles: when students practice math over the summer, math scores go up. What's your summer math plan this year? A great way to start is by ordering free summer workbook samples at summerpopsworkbooks.com. Reach out to our friend Pete there today and get your free samples. All right, Jen.
I want to ask the question. No, I want to ask the question because I want you to go first answering it.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
So sorry for the interruption, but that was all for me. Here's the question. I've been invited to apply to a school, but the time available to interview is not when I'm able to be there. Should I go around the person who is doing the scheduling? What do you think?
Well, my direct answer would be, I mean, if somebody called me and asked me that question, which someone has just asked that question, I would say yes, because if you've worked this hard to get the opportunity to someone's looked through your applications, looked through your resume, and they've called you and there's only one time available. I mean, either you can just decide, well, that's not a place that I want to work when they're so inflexible, or two, you could be polite and ask that person, is there someone else that I could talk to that could help me work this around? Jen, I have some very strong opinions on this and we only have 5 minutes, but what are some things you're thinking right now?
Well, wait, you can't do that.
Okay, well, you want me to give more strong opinions?
Yes, give your strong opinions.
Okay, here's Will's strong opinions. And I know I'm speaking to a world of educators who live this every day, and that my solution may not fit in every box. Okay, I'm just going to say that. But we live in a time when finding high quality educators is really hard. Why would we not, when we're trying to schedule someone in for interviews, if we run into a situation where we've created impossibility because we already set the schedule and then we call them and try to fit them into this one day, one slot, why would we not try to exercise flexibility in that situation if it means we may have a chance to get somebody really good? And so I just think the onus needs to come back on those of us that are doing the scheduling and interviewing to remember how hard it is sometimes to be on the other side of that. Now, I know there's a flip to that, which means that especially if you're pulling together committees and, but again, and some of those things may be beyond your control. But let me pause because I start ranting.
What I was going to say is I think a lack of flexibility is a problem. I agree with you. And I have found generally most educators are wonderful about this because we've all been there, right? We've all had the sick kid. We've all been going on the spring break. We've all been, scheduled, whatever. And so typically people are wonderful about that. But I think what you just said is a good reminder that we need to be flexible. And so it might be for this listener that the only thing he or she needs to do is say, I just can't be there, but boy, I sure want to. Are there any other opportunities? And if the answer is no, absolutely not, well, that might be an indicator that this isn't a place you want to work because the first time your kid gets strep throat, you might be feeling like you got in trouble.
I agree. I don't want to divulge any more about this question that came to me than I don't want to say enough that would shine a light on someone's story that they may not want public. Mm-hmm. But I will just say that this isn't the first time I've seen people face these kinds of situations. When I've been on the side of the interviewer group, I've tried to make it clear with whoever's helping me do my scheduling. If you run into something, let me know. I have had some folks that maybe they lived long distance. And so virtually bringing them in to that situation was the only option other than them not being able to attend. And if they were a high quality candidate. And Jen, it often depends on the kind of position too that you're looking for. Because if I'm, for instance, applying for a superintendent's role, by golly, I'm going to be there on when that slot is available. But if I'm applying for a teaching opening and there's a bunch of other candidates available, then it may be a little different. So
that's right.
Again, these Q&As are only 5 minutes, and but I do want to say I'll make a note to put this in the show notes. But our good friend Jimmy Casas, almost every year he does a PD offering called Hiring for Excellence, and I love what I love about that training is he just goes through his 20 years of all the craziness he's done in interviews, and kind of makes a list of just rules of thumb to keep in mind when you're on either side of that, so that you can navigate some of the weirdness involved. Jen, I don't know how we land this plane, but we need to move over to our wonderful guest. How can folks stay connected with you and your resources this week?
Yep, they can find me at jenschwanke.com and sign up for my newsletter there. It's called Principal Problems. Sign up and you get a weekly newsletter.
Oh, you don't want to miss that newsletter either. It's wonderful. And you can find today's show notes and all of our other resources at my website at williamdparker.com. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Why is IXL used in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts? Because it works. IXL is research proven to benefit all student populations, including English language learners and special education classrooms. IXL is an all-inclusive online learning and teaching solution for K-12 that accelerates achievement, saves teachers time, and more. This one platform helps you accomplish what normally would require dozens of other tools. For example, as students practice skills, IXL automatically differentiates learning to help them master concepts at their own pace. Teachers get real-time insights into how students are performing so they can provide timely support. What I love about IXL are the personalized SAT and ACT study plans. Students just need to enter the most recent test score, and IXL automatically generates a custom list of skills they should work on to improve their scores. Discover what IXL can do for your school. Visit IXL.com/PM today.
You're listening to Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast.
Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. And this week, I'm talking to my special guest, Ann Cummins Bogan. Ann Cummins Bogan began her career as an elementary school teacher, spending 20 years in both urban and suburban schools. And during that time, she took every opportunity to learn and grow and take on leadership roles to advance teaching and learning. She saw firsthand the challenges teachers face: limited time for planning and collaboration, limited resources, frustration, burnout, and a sense of being undervalued. Through her collaborative work with districts and school leaders, she realized the power of the teacher voice and experience, and realized the system needs reimagining. In 2012, she founded ACB Consulting, and since then, she's partnered with more than 250 schools nationwide. Her consulting work has ranged from support with instructional practices at the classroom level to strategic planning at the district level. At the heart of her work is the belief that for schools and school districts to be successful, engaging teacher voice in decisions about teaching and learning is critical. Her work with systems to design and build collaborative teams at all levels involves a shared commitment to ensure that all students thrive. Ann Cummins Bogan, welcome to Principal Matters Podcast. Why don't you fill in the gaps on that intro and tell listeners something else they may be surprised to know about you?
Well, good morning. I'm happy to be here. Good afternoon or good evening, whatever time it might be. What might people be interested in? I'll just stay in the lane of education. So I met my husband my first year of teaching. He worked as a student support specialist. And so I always say, why wouldn't I fall in love as a first year teacher with a student support specialist? And our son is starting his first year as an elementary school teacher in Minneapolis, where my husband and I met. So it's his first year, kind of tackling all the adventures of being a teacher. So it's great.
Yeah. Well, and I had the joy of meeting your daughter. The last time you and I connected, she jumped in the conversation all the way from her place overseas. And so what a wonderful family. And let me give some context to listeners. You and I have both worked for several years with a system of schools across Jefferson County, Kentucky, through the Archdiocese of Louisville's Catholic schools. And it's so interesting because when I work with those principals and leaders, and especially their superintendent, assistant superintendent, for years now, they have said to me, "Oh, Ann Cummins Bogan has talked to us about fill in the blank," or "Ann Cummins Bogan just worked with us on," etc. And I finally got so tired of hearing your name, Ann. I was just like, I'm going to meet you and I'm going to introduce you to Principal Matters listeners. So we spent some time together off recording, getting to know each other, but we've kind of known each other secondarily. So man, you spent so much time working up to the point where I discovered who you were. But I want you to take listeners back a little bit. You spent over 20 years in education, from teaching to representing teachers' unions. How has all those experiences shaped the way that you bridge the gap between leadership and teachers?
Hmm. Well, first I would say I think that the gap, probably we need to start to realize that those gaps exist almost by virtue of the need for the system to manage itself. And I think sometimes we equate people's positions with their knowledge, experience, expertise, all those synonyms. And so I think what I would say is that, at the core of whether you're a principal or a superintendent or a teacher or a union leader, at the core of the work is the success of students. And so it's really about trying to create the relationships and the mutual trust required for us to move past some of the power dynamics that come into play, and then respect each other's positions, because accountability does change at each level of the system. So I guess I would say it's that there's more in common than not, but that by virtue of a lot of tension on the system around time and systems and structures and hierarchies, we just sometimes create complexities that cause more tension than maybe they need to.
So let's sit on that tension for a little bit, because you play a really unique role in bridging the gap between teachers and admin. And now you play a really significant role in not just like negotiating those differences within a district level, but helping teachers and leaders get on the same page in terms of student outcomes and student learning. So, help us think about what are some of the lessons you've learned and how to bridge that gap.
I think the first is, the notion of clarity about what the goals are. And I think that's critical. So, one of the strategies that one of the key initiatives, if you will, or strategies that I use with schools is to build a collaborative team made up of the principal, teaching staff, and certificated staff as well, teacher assistants, and other every district and school has different names, but really building some clarity around what is it we're trying to accomplish as a school. And so we've narrowed down to 3 what we call our foundational practices: high quality instruction, a culture of belonging and rightful presence of all students, and effective systems and teams. And so I think once we can say, for example, decide what data matters, because that's a big one, right? So the whole data, what I write about with my work is that data is a trigger word for educators. It implies judgment immediately, and so we have to unpack that word data. A lot of words trigger educators, and I try not to shy away from the words. I try to, let's talk about why this feels bad. So I think like determining some data sources that say, what is our story? Like, what is our school doing currently that works? And what are some things we could improve? And then if we can build some conversation around that among principals and their staff, then, they can start to roll their sleeves up together and say, okay, so what are some ways we should do this? But I would say in the early work, it really becomes a learning journey. Rather than there's a lot of implementation that occurs, as you know. And I think that sometimes the implementation is so disconnected from the beginning or the end that that's what stirs up the frustration.
Well, even in prepping for today's conversation, I was looking back through some notes, and I had written down a question from a leader in a training I had done where they were trying to grapple with how do I maintain the instructional goals or initiatives or mandates coming to me through the system, my district or state or federal government, in conjunction with the ones that I know are the most important for me at this site that I'm leading. And I know you see that same tension, Anne. And so as someone who facilitates that with teams, Um, how do you help them navigate that tension?
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, I'm going to pull us back a bit, like 50,000 feet. I think the work has to sort of start at this district level, where again, that clarity of objectives has to, we have to make meaning of like, what are those priorities? I think one of the things that I sort of tongue in cheek talk about is like every school district's creating strategic plans, and everybody's trying to figure out their their thing. And when you really look at education, that doesn't really change much, right? Like if we have a strategic plan, if we have a set of district priorities, they need to focus on high quality instruction, they need to focus on climate and culture, they need to focus on teams, and then they need to focus on some kind of financial stability, parent engagement. And so I think where I've had success, if we talk about our shared partner in the Archdiocese of Louisville, we've created parallel structures for their district improvement plan, if you will, or their district priorities and their school improvement plans. And that's a practice I've used in multiple places where I work. And so we create a school improvement planning template. And again, school improvement sometimes to people implies something negative. So this continuous improvement, these priorities, if we can get the district and the school to align, okay, we know we're focusing on high quality instruction. So at a district level, here are the areas of our focus. Now we need to create the discretion at school sites to look at that and say, how does that align with our data, with our students, with our teachers' capacity to, implement the instruction. And then at the school level, they have to take it down the next level because we know the capacity of teachers varies across schools. I mean, within a school, right? And so I think it's just that tight alignment of, we know high quality instruction is a area of focus. Our district priorities are such. So schools, we need you to build priorities that are aligned, but obviously implement the strategies that align with your student data and your teacher competencies, and then so on and so forth. Same with the other areas. What that I think has allowed is the principals to have less air traffic control. I mean, I think the air traffic control for principals is another area where I think most systems are not always as intentional as they need to be about how principals are given information and how they implement those at those sites. But in the short answer, if there is such a thing in my world, it would be the alignment of district and school priorities intentionally that then allow the discretion at schools to create the plans they need to create to meet the needs of their students.
So Principal Matters listeners know that I like to summarize and speak directly back to them. And so it's so you said so much in such a short way. And so because I asked you a really hard question, I've never had anybody use that analogy, the air traffic controller. It's just almost like the principal is just calling the shots constantly and all these things are moving. And so your vision is, okay, hey, let's actually bring everyone to the table who needs to be, so that we're not just air traffic controlling all these things, but we're actually all going the same way in the same direction. I know that sounds so pie in the sky and so ideal, but that's also what has shaped your work. So I want to switch gears a little bit. Feel free to speak to that before I ask the next question, if you have anything else you want to say.
I think that's it. And I think the only other thing I would say that's critical to that is also timing. So we have to remember that, there's a lot of time for central office administrators, particularly, to be at work when for sure teachers are not there over the summer and principals are there, but, there may not be set structures for them to be engaging in collaborative meetings. And so sometimes it seems like summer is the time where I sort of, and I have great respect for all central office administrators and the good work that they do. Like, it's critical, but they have a lot more time to dream up ideas for what schools will do. And so, in my experience as a teacher, you take summer off and you have a day and a half of institute where all those great ideas that central office cooked up over the summer kind of get landed on your plate. And then meanwhile, these 25 or 30 kids walk in and you're trying to make sense of what you just got informed of in the last 16 hours. And so I think the other thing I would say is it requires us to look at the structure and timing of when plans are created, when new initiatives are being considered. Because once the kids hit the door on that first day of school, the principal and the teacher plate is full every day with students and families. And so if in October we say we're going to introduce some new training on X, Y, or Z, like what does that mean for a teacher who is maybe, just getting a handle on who their students are and moving along, or for that principal who's been building the relationships and now ready to go in and start to do some, observations of teachers and provide feedback. And meanwhile, we've got like initiatives cannot come at us 12 weeks into school and then expect, because we're 12 weeks, we only have so much time left. So anyway, I would throw that nuance in, is that it's not just the how, but it's also the when that I see is critical to the system.
Oh, this is so important. And that's why I sat on this question for so long, is because bridging that gap between leadership and teachers, and that principal often plays that middle manager role between those two worlds. There's going to be enough on their plate, regardless of what the mandates and initiatives are. So I don't know. I feel like right now, as I speak to Principal Matters listeners, there may be some of you that are in that role of air traffic controller at the school. Some of you may be supporting the role of leaders. Some of you may be aspiring leaders. I want to kind of focus a little bit on the heart of your work. Because I know your reputation of working with some of the leaders you work with, I know that you dig deeply into Charlotte Danielson's work. So I'm curious what elements of her framework continue to influence your thinking about effective teaching and leadership.
Yeah, I had the privilege of working directly with Charlotte for about 8 years. It's actually where I started my consulting work, because I sat on a team where we were designing our teacher evaluation process. That was back in 2010, kind of right before all the heavy duty, high stakes federal legislation came on. And so I really got to know her work deeply, and she's an amazing person. I think that one of the key pieces of her work is the basic theory of constructivist learning, and the idea that learning by doing, right? Like kids learn through what they do. The other thing is that I'd say about Charlotte's work is people may not realize she did, mounds and mounds of research when she designed the framework for teaching. It was actually part of a collaborative set of work that she did with other people to build. They were working on the praxis exam for new teachers. So that's really how the work started. So when you look at her research appendix, it's all the greats, right? Fullen and Hattie and Tomlinson and all those people. But I would say that maybe one of the things that people don't understand is if you ground effective teaching in the theory that students learn by what they do or through what they do, then that means that when we design learning experiences for students, they have to be active in what they're doing. And so that really leads to some of those components in the framework for teaching, and all the way from, the idea of how do we plan lessons, how do we create the classroom culture, how do we use our professional time, has to result in students having opportunities for active engagement in what it is they're learning. So I think that's the most critical point.
Well, what I appreciate about that framework in your work too, and again, because I hear the conversations around the work that you guys do together, is your focus on any kind of development that you're doing is always back on the student. What is going to be the result of what we're doing or planning or developing on the learning of that student? Because this conversation for me is always shifting over to the leader's role in that conversation comes. So can you talk a little bit about what you've observed about the pressures of school leadership in trying to take what research says is best practice and actually see it implemented within a school?
Yeah. So I would say that principal's shock absorber came from a mentor of mine by the name of Dr. Patrick Dolan. And he was a gentleman who worked in the private sector for a long time, just on labor management partnerships, getting union and management to be able to kind of come to a place of common vision, if you will, and he recognized how the hierarchy in organizations can create top-down punitive practices. And so when you look at a school district, if we go back up to your reference to silos, like the central office is often designed in silos. So we have, our curriculum and instruction specialist, and their job is to design curriculum and instruction. And then over here, we have another student service specialist who might be in charge of special education. And then we have our human resource specialist, and we have our professional learning specialist. I mean, every system is different, and they're by design paid to design these things and do them. And so he always talked about the need to sort of blur the lines between those departments. But if we go, and I really have an answer to this question, but I think I'm kind of building, I have a vision of the way we map the system in my head. And so if we go from sort of the superintendent, board of education, the governance structure that then leads to this central office specialist, who then often are the ones directing the work of the principal, then the principal is navigating that air traffic control. Sometimes my other analogy is meteor shower, right? Of just like you go to a principal meeting and you get 5 things that you're supposed to take back to your staff. And then, principals have to go back and lay those 5 things on their staff. So I think it's that idea of navigating all the demands that come from the top, because even though the principal is the leader of their building, they are often there could be not enough support. That's also an issue. There could be a lot. Not only is there, it's like air traffic control, like the radios went dead, like we can't get any help. In the sweet spot, there is obviously a 2-way information system that keeps people informed. But so the principal is typically navigating all those mandates. They've just come back from their weekly or monthly principal meeting, and now they're supposed to put these things on their staff meeting agenda. And they, like you say, have to figure out how to pick and choose what of that information is most critical and what might be most harmful if they lay it on their staff without considering the context. So I think, that's one piece of it. I think the other major challenge that I see for the whole system is just a lack of time. So, it's often just, principals go, they get the latest updates. Okay, now at your next meeting, go share these updates. Okay, and now teachers, I think I do the math. I think teachers have less than 5% of their time is really designated for thinking time. 97% of their time is doing time, and so can you imagine any other profession where you had 3% of the time to think about what you're going to do when in fact your job is an intellectual job? So anyway, principals struggle not only with where the demands come from, and then that doesn't even count the families and community, but also like the lack of time to make sense or prioritize anything, which means everybody's working really long hours and not getting enough sleep. And that's a whole nother factor for principals and teachers and central office folk.
Well, what I appreciate about that, and first of all, because I'm a summarizer, that governance model from boards of education to superintendents to specialists and directors to, and there's so many titles for those, assistant superintendents and coordinators, to principals. And then within the school itself, depending on its size, the assistant principals and the deans and the department chairs within there, and then your staff and teachers as a totality. And then eventually all of that gets to the student, him or herself. And then even within that model, you've got your state mandates, your federal mandates, you've got all of this motion that's happening. And because I've done this work for so long, I've talked to a lot of leaders across the spectrum, private, charter, public, and there seems to be this assumption within each of those spheres that it might be better in the other one. And I'm just telling you from someone who's worked closely in each of those settings, they all have those similar pressures of that funnel that seems to always come down to that pressure of what does it look like within the classroom from all this various input that's happening. So I don't know. I just need to say this to leaders, because when I think about the leaders that I see working in highly effective ways within their schools, somehow, either one, they figure out better ways to improve the systems so that they're working, like we talked about earlier, in parallel towards those student outcomes, or two, they learn to work around the system and create their own system within their school that works because they know that that's the only way they're going to reach meaningfully the learning that needs to happen with kids. So that kind of takes me to the next question that I want to set on, and feel free to respond to anything I say.
Sure.
Yeah, but you focus a lot on building and designing and leading better systems so that teachers and leaders don't have to spin all these craziness, create all these options to work in spite of the system that I have. You're stepping right in the middle of it. So can you walk us through what those domains look like for you?
Yeah, I would say probably not different than most systems consultants. There's sort of a needs assessment component to it. So what's the story and who knows it? Oftentimes our work starts at the district level because, as I mentioned, we can go in and work with the school, and that's really rewarding and great work, and in some senses is more tangible. And I do that a lot. I work with principals and I go through classrooms with them, and we talk about best ways to coach. And and in fact, you and I will, some of this, we both coach some of the same principals, and they get something out of both of our conversations. So we must be, we must be brilliant in our own right and then collective. But the needs assessment piece of it is just really trying to understand, what is the work, and then how do people sort of feel about the work, right? So when you named it, eventually gets down to the students. I would say it may or may not eventually get down to the students, because sometimes, depending on how detached the system is from itself, I've talked to leaders before that say, "Oh, we fully implemented our PBIS program and it's going great," and then you grab a couple principals and they're like, not so sure about that. PBI who? You know what I mean? So it's sometimes it's like we think by telling. It's kind of like the same issue with the classroom. Sometimes telling is teaching, and we know that that's not true. So a needs assessment, and then again, clarifying, helping the system to organize its priorities. Whether that at the most sort of formalized process would be through some kind of a strategic plan, or just in the, if there are district or, already developed domains or priorities, kind of aligning those. I think part of the needs assessment then is also figuring out that connective tissue between the district or the central office or, and the schools themselves. So I too have had an opportunity to work, with private, laboratory schools, those kinds of, and so, as you know, like the infrastructure is always slightly different, but I do think that the connective tissue between whoever those decision makers are, especially if they are limited in scope in terms of perspective, like how does the system inform itself? So we have a framework, and one of the critical components to it is what we call our robust information system. So it's the way that information is shared and then also received. And so once we determine the connective tissue between the, let's say it's the district and the schools, then we can help to build bridges, right? We build typically some kind of a structure at the district level that's made up of principals, district administrators, union leadership, if it's a unionized system, teacher voice regardless. And then at each school, which is where I think really the motor is the school is a similar structure, a school leadership team. And I always say, leadership teams at the school level are not an innovative idea. They've been around. I sat on them myself, but I think we often talk about school leadership teams that move from logistics to learning. So making sure that this team is really about what's happening with our student data, how are teachers collaborating, if there is, such a thing as a PLC. Sometimes that's a bad acronym, but is there time for teacher collaboration? How do teachers use that? And then how does that translate into the classroom? And then it's just a matter of, like you say, it's build, design, and lead, but it's always kind of coming back to, do we have a place where we know what we're trying to do? Do we have mechanisms to listen and learn as to how it's going? And then do we have systems and processes for refining what needs to be refined, to make it happen? So needs assessment, and then helping to design and build structures, and then, support in building and developing those teams.
I don't have to tell you this, Anne, but I'm going to say it anyway, that what you just described in a macro level is what happens on a micro level every single day in a good classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's kind of the circle I have to always make when I'm coming back to what are the systems and practices that need to be designed, no matter how complex it is, for student learning to happen. And so that, and I'm not going to repeat everything you just said, but just working through the understanding what people are actually thinking and feeling, to strategically prioritizing what are we supposed to be accomplishing, to connecting those decision makers together, and then evaluating, okay, how are we doing, listening to the feedback, and then refining the practice. That's the cycle of learning that happens with every child. And so sometimes I think we make it harder than it has to be, because we forget that those cycles of learning in any exceptional classroom are the same cycles of learning that should happen in any organization or district or culture. Anything else you want to add to that before we?
Well, just the only other thing I'd underscore is that we make it more complicated. And part of it is that at the root of that is a lack of true, I don't want to say respect, or I don't want this to be a blame. I think it's just a simple pathology of the system, that we feel like we have to continually create more stuff rather than letting some stuff sit. So I think, even for the student, right? Like, I'm going to use a quick analogy. As a mom, I remember like taking my kids to a museum and thinking like, there's so much to see. And so, come on, okay, you saw this, let's get to the next thing. And I don't know where I fit in that, what I actually did. I'd like to believe that I didn't rush my kids through anything, but I think like if you walk in a space and there's enough there to explore and discover, who cares what's on the second or third floor if they're actually getting something out of it? And I think, sometimes we think if we just left teachers alone, or if we just left principals alone, or with enough structure and the right kind of systems for them to ask for the help when they need it, and for us to ensure that, and then I'm a big fan of central office having regular drop-ins at the school sites to see how things are going.
Yeah.
Of course we have to reduce suspicion around all of that so that it's seen, but I just think sometimes it's like this idea, and maybe it's consultants like us, that people keep thinking there's something outside of these four walls that is brilliant, and we got to keep looking for what that is so that we can fix it, as opposed to like, what's happening within these four walls that I could capitalize on, and maybe ask for a little help around this, that, or the other. I'm not sure these materials are the right ones, or I'm not sure this calendar's working for me. And I didn't say the word calendar, scheduling, I didn't mean to bring that up, because we know that's a nightmare for any school leader or district leader. But that's what I think. I think we just are always throwing more stuff at the system. They're always doing too much. And at the end of the day, I always say, like, there's one teacher who has to sense make all of that and convey it successfully to a diverse group of learners in a way that they all thrive. And I just have to say that, like, we just are doing too much always.
Oh, that's so good. There's so much more we could say about that, Anne.
Right.
But you're so right. And to come back to something you said earlier, if teachers only have about 5% of their working time to actually think, it's the same a lot of time for principals and leaders too.
Mm.
The farther you get removed, though, from those student environments, the more time you actually have to sometimes plan and think. And so the tension becomes when well-meaning people create more work or more systems because of the thinking time they've had for those that are boots on the ground and doing the work. And so it's impossible to bring this full circle. But I think one of the things you and I try to do in our work is to invite decision makers and boots on the ground people together, and then guide their time to think together so that the actions that they're taking are the most meaningful. And then I love it. Jen Schwanke, who co-hosts my show with me, said, has told me before in her younger years, she used to say, give me a good teacher and then I'll just get out of their way. And then she began to realize, give me a good teacher and I'll give them a good system and then let me get out of their way. And so sometimes we get those mixed up. We either want system or we want good people, but you got to have both, and then you can get out of their way. And so let's wrap this up with a conversation that you and I talked about a little bit offline before, and that is this reflecting on the two sides of the same coin, the cynicism and the hope that all of us bring, because you and I have been doing that even in this conversation, the angst on the one hand, but then the hope on the other.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I wonder, as you're saying that, like, I don't know, like when we talk about that cynicism and hope, right? That I just am repeating what you said because it's helping me construct my idea. But I don't know that when I'm supporting a system, I don't know that I'm wholly aware of it. I do think the cynicism is getting a lot of play. I think ever since COVID, the idea that the teaching profession is just the worst thing to do. And why would anyone, my son is starting as a teacher. I couldn't be more proud. And people say like, well, why would he do that? And so I do like to, I feel compelled to want to play down the cynicism a little bit. But I will say that, we have to recognize that it's a flawed system. Like, if we really think that because when I think I have great ideas of what we could do to change some things, but we don't have time for that. But I do think that it's working with people to find out what they care about and what they know, what their lived experiences are, what their priorities are, and then helping them figure out ways to make that their work, right? And like make that be the focus and the place where they can put their energy. And I think that's where it is. It's sort of cutting through the cynicism, because knowing that if we focus on that, it's a non-starter and we're never moving. But if we can, what I see is educators are passionate, committed, even on their worst day, they are there because they care about kids and they care about, their communities. And so let's lift that voice, even if it's just a principal in their own office, or it's a teacher in their own classroom, or it's an assistant superintendent or a board president, for all that matters, just helping them see and validate their hopes and dreams. And that sounds a little hokey, but it's kind of true. And then how can you make those things actionable? And I think that's how I guess think about it in my work.
No, I love that because, and I think that's a great way to, wrap up this conversation, Anne, because I think your work has just been so deeply committed to the actions necessary to do this work well. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't do that if you didn't have the hope and the belief and the experience that when this work is done well, students learn and have flourishing, thriving, caring, belonging experiences where they become a stronger version of themselves before they were in that setting. Mm-hmm. And so I know I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to Principal Matters listeners, but I do think it's important for us to both look objectively at the things in front of us that need to be improved and call it what it is, while at the same time holding out the hope for what we know is possible when we can engage in best practices with students or teachers. And just to repeat what you said, make the biggest difference right where we are. Because we may not be able to affect national policy or state policy. I mean, occasionally you'll have a voice in those settings, but those things seem to change so much and are so disruptive that making a difference right where you are is going to be often the most meaningful way that you can make a difference too. As we wrap up, feel free to speak anything else to that, but how can listeners stay connected with you and your work, and any parting words of advice that you want to leave with listeners?
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. No, yeah, we have a website, acbconsulting.org. So check us out there. And then we are working on a conference in April. I think by the time maybe folks are listening to this, there might be some more information. And I just think it's the most important work. And I think that, on any given day, somebody has a better idea than we do, or we have a better idea than somebody else. And so just, keep the faith. I guess that's what I would say.
Well, Principal Matters listeners, the website is ACB Consulting. And of course, if you connect the dots, that's Ann Cummins Bogan, acbconsulting.com. You will not be disappointed. Ann has all kinds of wonderful resources, downloadables, quick guides for leaders. And so, Ann, thank you so much for the work that you do with schools across the U.S. and in the schools that you and I get to partner with together. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for doing what matters and listening in this week. And until next time, thanks for your leadership. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, would you take a moment and like, share, subscribe, or leave us a review? In fact, if you share it out with a friend, even more people can become a part of these conversations. Sign up for our newsletter at williamdparker.com for even more free resources. And don't forget to check out our website to learn more about our books, professional development offerings, Grow Academies, masterminds, executive coaching, and keynote presentations. Wow, let's keep learning together. And thank you for doing what matters.
Principal Matters.